Hello, and welcome to Ex Cult Ed, the podcast where I share my experiences, thoughts, and feelings after leaving the truth, otherwise known as the 2x2 way, the fellowship, the one true way. You get the picture. My hope is that in sharing this, it will be cathartic for me, and perhaps make you, dear listener, feel less alone if you've been through or are going through something similar. This is my story. I wanted to do an episode on how I've struggled with decision making and self-confidence after leaving the cult. However, this led me to look into what studies have been done out there on the effects of people leaving cults to see if this was more than just a me thing. And then I got sidetracked going down the rabbit hole of reading research and going off on tangents. Some of the themes that came out wouldn't be surprising to many of us. For example, that former cult members show signs of depression, guilt, fear, passivity, paranoia, struggling to be intimate with others, and constant perfectionism. I'll start with one exploratory study I read from 2017 where they interviewed 31 former cult members to find out what causes people to join or leave cults. This study defined cults as an organized group or a solitary person whose purpose is to dominate cult members by using psychological manipulation and pressure strategies. They also only included people who had joined the group after age 16 rather than being born into it. They looked at what was going on in the people's lives before they joined, during their time in the cult, and the year after they left the cult. Not surprisingly, the main barrier for leaving was family and relationships inside the cult, feeling reassured through being part of the group, as well as difficulty questioning the group's creeds. And on the other hand, the main things that helps them leave was their lack of faith in the group's creeds, as well as social intervention. In my case, this was the same thing. I never would have left the cult if I hadn't met my then partner who helped me discover life outside it. They suggested that cult membership shares some characteristics with addictive disorders. For example, persisting despite damage, having an exclusive place in members' thoughts, and high psychiatric comorbidity. They talk about it in this study as well, but if you think about how at every meeting and get-together, we got so much positive reinforcement from being listened to and being part of something, but at the same time, we were also anxious about how shit we were. Or to put it more nicely, we were all so intimidated by how good everyone else seemed to be, and how we were these massive failures and might not even make it to heaven, but we were so happy to just be part of something that also let us escape the pressures of everyday life and focus on the faraway next life. So we got all the good endorphins alongside super anxiety. This study talks about people who had been living I'm going to call it normal life before joining a cult, and then were trying to resume living a normal life after they left. Even people who had previously lived a so-called normal life felt helpless to resume it after joining and then leaving a cult if they didn't have support from family or friends. Now consider those of us who were born into this cult life. Of course it seemed impossible for us to leave. We didn't even have an idea of what normal life was, let alone if we could live it. I used to blame a lot on not knowing about alcohol, but in reality, normal life involves a lot more than alcohol. I think a lot of it is just not having the self-confidence to fit in anywhere. I certainly do feel like the odd one out a lot in everyday life, and especially in the workplace. But just generally, I do experience quite a bit of imposter syndrome. Having been told all my life that I knew nothing and God knew everything and I was just supposed to have faith, of course it makes sense that I would assume everyone else around me knows what they're doing a lot more than me, and that any success I have is just luck. The thing is, logically I know I'm intelligent and I can learn and do anything I want to, but on an emotional level, I don't believe those things about myself. And I do largely think that deep-seated feeling comes in part from having grown up in the cult. Back to this study, the authors found that the ex-members' lives were impacted in all aspects: social, family, professional, and financial. One way they said that being in a cult was similar to an addictive disorder was that a lot of time was spent devoted solely to the cult, which results in social impairment. And look, I'll be the first to put my hand up and say that I might be a little bit socially impaired, at least when it comes to self-confidence and putting myself out there. I often feel like everyone else has all these qualities and knowledge and experience that I don't have. Therefore, I'm just bad at everything. When the actual fact is, I'm good at a lot of things except believing in myself. Another factor they said cult life had in common with addictive disorders was the feeling of relief that people have when they begin membership. I remember when I first professed. And for those of you who don't understand this, the preachers in our area would do what was called testing the mission once or twice a year, where they'd ask for anyone who wanted to serve God to stand to their feet. This was called professing, and it was basically you showing that you were starting out in God's way. Professing basically meant that you were committed to upholding the cult's ideals of what it meant to serve God, and that at Sunday morning and Wednesday night reads, you would pray and also give your testimony. I wanted to profess when I was 9, but a huge traumatic event that I won't go into in this podcast stopped me from attending the mission that was tested that year, so I couldn't profess, which meant I had to wait another year. I remember feeling so anxious all the time because I wasn't professing, so if I died, I wouldn't go to heaven. I remember being so stressed and terrified of death and the dark and anything that would make me die when I wasn't right with God. So the feeling of relief when I finally professed was huge. As a side note, I'm still afraid of the dark to this day. The researchers also found that former members felt social difficulties after leaving, which is not surprising given the social isolation imposed on members of the cult. They also found that family and friends were an important protective factor that could help ex-cult members return and rehabilitate back into society. Just like treatment programs for addiction that involve family result in more successful outcomes, ex-cult members who had family support also had better outcomes when reintegrating with society. This study does highlight the value of staying in contact with family we still have in the cult, if that's possible without harming our own mental well-being, of course, because we might actually be the help and support that someone else needs to get out of it. It was this moment while reading the study that I had a huge oh shit moment. The authors refer to some other researchers who said that immersion in the manipulative culture of a cult can lead to the development of a temporary dependent personality disorder. So I went and read about that. And the symptoms definitely hit home and make a lot of sense for me. And look, I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not going to diagnose myself with anything, but I can at least look at the symptoms that I identify with and use that as a reference frame for self-reflection and personal development. I would say that I definitely have these sort of traits rather than the disorder itself, and that these traits would come from a combination of my personality, my life events, and being raised in the cult. And actually, some of the symptoms are things I had been working out myself over the past year while doing some self-reflecting. I personally have a strong desire for family and social support, and I know that in itself is not weird or unusual, considering that humans are social creatures, so it is something we need. But my desire for family and close people has sometimes been quite extreme. And this might get pretty personal, but I think sharing my experience could help others, and also to make myself and anyone else listening realize that coming out of the cult isn't just going to magically solve all our problems. In fact, in my case, and in the case of a few other people I've seen, it can bring up a lot more problems that we didn't really know we had. I guess the next part is finding out and acknowledging all the stuff that comes up for us afterwards. Honestly, I left 5 years ago and I don't know if I've progressed or regressed as far as my mental health. The more I delve into it, the more that seems to come up. But I suppose that's a good thing because it's all there and it's something I need to acknowledge. After all, I can't address something if I'm in denial about it. I've been seeing a therapist recently, and whenever I bring up things that trigger me or talk about the way I feel about things or even how inferior I feel to other people, he reminds me to be kind to myself. I know how I feel isn't logical, so I keep being ashamed about it or apologizing for it. But he keeps reminding me that it's perfectly normal and makes complete sense that I feel the way I do because of what I've been through. And that is true. So for me, I need to work on acknowledging that I'm feeling a certain way and then realizing that this isn't just coming from nowhere. It makes sense. And when it makes sense and I realize that it's not wrong for me to feel that way because it comes from a valid place, just that feeling that way isn't serving me, then I can start to face it. I went to look at the DSM-5 to see if I resonate with the symptoms of dependent personality disorder, which I'll refer to as DPD for short. One of them was difficulty making routine decisions without input, reassurance, and advice from others. I identify with this, and I also think it makes a lot of sense based on how we in the cult were brought up. Everything we did was either because it was God's will, or for the good of the group, or for the good of our family. We were strongly discouraged from being selfish or doing things for ourselves. So to have difficulty making decisions and choices completely on our own and independent of the creeds of the cult makes perfect sense. On some level, it feels so wrong to be even considering ourselves and our own needs, let alone having a choice about what we want to do or eat or wear. I know in the past others have become frustrated with me for going to so many people for advice about the same thing. And I guess that came from a place of not trusting myself and how I feel and how I think, yet because I put others on a pedestal, I trust their opinion more than my own. Another symptom was feeling vulnerable and helpless when alone. Since my last relationship, I had realized that I really struggled to be alone with myself. Initially, I thought that was because I couldn't face all the trauma and feelings I had going on, and also because I lacked any family and social support. And maybe that's part of it. I also definitely have a fear of abandonment, which is a normal way to think when you grew up feeling like most of the relationships and love around you were conditional on you behaving in a certain way and believing in a certain thing. It can make one very distrusting of love and struggle to accept or believe that someone would actually love them with all their flaws and no strings attached. I'm always looking for the reasons why a person would stop loving me or why they might leave me because I let them down. We were raised to believe that our Father in heaven loved us unconditionally, but that wasn't true. There were so many conditions. And now that I think about it, you can love someone with all your heart, but there's still conditions. It's healthy and necessary to have conditions. Even with your own family, there are conditions to your love for them. If the person or people we love start behaving in a way that causes us harm, the love would eventually die. So I at least have stopped looking for unconditional love because I don't think that unconditional love is the sort of love I should be giving away either. But I do definitely want the strongest and deepest sort of love possible. Another similar but different symptom was an unrealistic preoccupation with being left alone and unable to care for themselves. And yes, 100% I feel this. We've gone from this worldwide group that called themselves our family and from having a father that was with us and taking care of us always to being alone in the world without either of those things. I do think that being in the cult contributes to this, but it is important to say that in my particular case, I was raised by a single mother who I was very dependent on. And I also didn't have any variety in carers or support systems, so I was extremely dependent on one person only. And my worst fear was losing my soul support, which then happened when I was a teenager. I had to think about being alone at an age where I was unable to care for myself. So I definitely don't think this is crazy to feel, but at my age now, probably something I shouldn't be preoccupied with. Another symptom of DPD was fear of disagreeing with others and risking disapproval, and an oversensitivity to criticism, which I definitely have felt. I take criticism to mean that I'm a failure. I should have been perfect and I wasn't. I let them down and I let everyone else down. And when it comes to disagreeing with others, I don't have enough confidence in myself to even put myself out there to do that. I tend to just shut down if I disagree, unless it's someone who I feel very secure and safe that they won't abandon me if I have a different viewpoint to them. Then I'm a master debater. I do think in the cult we were raised to think very much one way. We were taught to believe that our elders and the preachers were far more experienced and far more wise than us, which also taught us not to rely on our own experience and our own learning. So if we couldn't rely on our own experience, how could we be confident enough to disagree with someone else? Another symptom of DPD was desperately seeking another relationship when one ends. This one was a huge one for me. I have previously been a serial monogamist and definitely relate to this need to be in a relationship and the fear of existing without being in one. This did lead me to cling on to people who weren't at all good for me and who I wasn't good for. Relationships that were toxic for both myself and the other person. After my last relationship, I went through a few experiences that made me realize this was something about me that I needed to work on. I consciously made a decision to focus on building up a support network of good friends, which has definitely helped mitigate this tendency of mine. That said, I am in a relatively new relationship right now, and I feel very good and safe and secure in it. But along the way, I have also been aware of my thoughts and tendencies and have been constantly questioning the way I think and feel, as well as discussing these things with my partner. There is still a level of fear for me around talking about specific things, and especially things that I see as big flaws with myself, or times when I've failed in the past. But I'm starting to realize that I am much more than my flaws and my past, and despite what and who I may have been, I can change that and be the person I am and want to be now. And the last symptom of DPD that I'll share for today was an excessive need to obtain nurturance and support from others, even allowing others to impose themselves rather than risk rejection or disapproval. This one is scary because it means that myself or others like me could easily allow people to abuse or take advantage of us if we aren't introspecting and aware of the decisions we're making and why we're making them. Also, people with DPD could tolerate situations that others would immediately leave, including verbal, physical, and sexual abuse. This is something I've already known about myself and have real-life experience with. From what I've read, people with DPD could tend to be naive and have poor boundaries, which is definitely something I've experienced. And when in abusive relationships, they could stay because of their fear of abandonment and the belief that they can't function without support. This belief that I can't function without support has been with me for years. The one thing that I've found that has helped me with this belief that I can't function without support is actually having some stable friends. And these are friends that I don't rely on for everyday life things, but they're friends that I feel I can go to whenever I need to talk about something. And I'm finding that just knowing that I have that support network gives me enough strength to start relying on myself. And it has helped me cut out some abusive and toxic relationships too, which is a huge step for me. I guess the next stage is working on just knowing my own worth in myself instead of valuing myself based on how much other people value me and how useful I am to others. But again, that would be a normal feeling after being in a cult where we did always put others first and ourselves last. Of course, our self-worth was based on what other people thought. So clearly I've gotten sidetracked from my original mission with this episode and zoned in on dependent personality disorder. I also listened to a few really good podcasts on DPD. One of them was by Two Shrinks Pod, and if you're interested to learn more about it, I recommend giving them a listen. But I'm just going to pull out a few things that resonated with me personally. They went into some of the different perspectives on DPD, starting with psychodynamic theory. The interesting thing that came out of this was the idea that individuals with DPD idolize their partners. They have the feeling that if their partner doesn't love them, then they have no self-worth. As young people in the cult, we definitely idolize the preachers and put them on a pedestal and turn to them for instruction, but also our parents and elders in general. They also suggested that denial could be a strong defense mechanism. Individuals with DPD deny that the world is hostile, which enables them to be childlike and naive in how they act. It also could lead them to deny their own hostile impulses. For example, anger is threatening to them, so they suppress their own anger, which could lead to a huge build-up inside. I definitely have experienced this. When others who I'm close to become angry with me, I tend to withdraw and take on all of their anger. I definitely feel anger, but I don't express it. I put it in a box somewhere else, and it either never comes out or potentially comes out a few weeks later. Next, they covered interpersonal theory, which described people with DPD as being seen by others as generous and thoughtful, but they submit to other people who they believe are more competent than them and give up control of their own lives. When it comes to relationships ending, they can become even more submissive, which makes their partner even more dominant and powerful. They listed a few causes for DPD, but I'll mainly go into the one that applies to me because this episode isn't about DPD, it's more about how being in the cult can affect a person's mental health with a focus on my own personal experience, which relates to DPD. I really feel like there are a lot of similarities between the causes and symptoms of DPD and the culture of the cult. In particular, when they delved into cognitive theory, which said that if you act helpless, then you eventually start to see yourself as helpless. Individuals with DPD describe themselves as weak, fragile, inadequate, and incompetent. In addition, they use denial to cope and don't look too deeply inwards, or they get distressed. I mean, I can definitely see some similarities here with our culture in the cult that would lend itself to some of us having these traits. It was certainly drummed into us that God was all-powerful and he was the protector and we were just the meek little sheep. The world was ravening wolves. Even using those sort of descriptors make it seem like we are weak and fragile. How would a sheep ever defend itself against a wolf? It wouldn't, because it has the shepherd for that. We were taught to rely completely on God, which meant relying on the cult. And not only were we fragile sheep, we were sinners too, which further lowered our self-esteem and made us feel lower than everyone else. It's a weird dichotomy when I think about it, how we thought that we were blessed because we were separate from the world, but we also really viewed ourselves as weaker than the world in a way, because we were afraid of the ravening wolves and the influence that they could have on us. We thought that we needed God to protect us from everybody around us. And following on from the not thinking too deeply and only focusing on the pleasant elements of life really explains how people in the cult can seem so happy, but also so shallow. I often felt like conversations went nowhere. Most of the talk was about who got married and who got baptized and who ate eggs for breakfast instead of porridge and how beautiful it was to attend the funeral of so-and-so who was faithful to the end and so on. Conversations were more based on facts about what was happening rather than talking about what people thought and felt about what was happening. More often than not, we would express positive emotions like joy, happiness, love, but I rarely heard people express negative emotions. I know that we all felt them. I know we all felt sad and angry, depressed, jealous, but because we viewed these natural emotions as ungodly, we didn't talk about them. Instead, we just tried to deny those parts of ourselves. In the podcast I listened to, they also described the self-schemas of individuals with DPD as being humble, cooperative, and considerate. They downplay achievements. All of our achievements weren't really ours. They belonged to God. Every good thing we did was because of God, but every bad thing we did was completely on us. In addition, the negative self-schemas included a core belief of being completely helpless and alone, and the conditional beliefs were that they could only function if they had access to somebody competent, and they would die if abandoned. We sort of did have that view in the cult. We even sang hymns about it. There were so many examples of things we sang in hymns that really reinforced these beliefs. We sang about daring not to walk alone, wandering alone in the desert before we were found. We sang of Christ being the only one that could satisfy and that we wanted to live for him alone. We sang of him protecting and defending his trusting sheep. Of course we left feeling helpless. Even though leaving the cult in itself was a huge thing, we'd been brainwashed to believe that we were incompetent and weak and fragile, and we had to depend on God for everything. We believed that without him we were nothing. So after leaving the cult, we basically had to start building ourselves up from nothing. I also feel like perhaps a lot of us, well, me anyway, have been holding on to a lot of these feelings of being inadequate and not being allowed to show negative emotions, particularly anger. I think this could be both a conscious and a subconscious thing. Consciously, because I don't want to appear bitter to those still in the cult. I don't want them to look at me and use my life as a justification of why the cult is right and those who leave are wrong. So in a way, I still feel pressure to put on a front, especially when I'm talking to anyone who is still in the cult. I feel a lot of shame whenever anything in my life goes wrong now, such as relationship breakdowns or lapses in my mental health, because I feel like I should be this strong, happy person since I finally got out. But why should I? I'm only human. Also, in Two Shrinks Pod, they said that individuals with DPD can view the world as very black and white. For example, they don't think that they have strengths in some areas and weaknesses in others. They just view themselves as totally weak and helpless. I would say that a lot of us in the cult did view ourselves that way. That was the ideal state for us to be in, completely helpless and dependent on God and therefore the cult. I still can't get over how we just kept referring to ourselves as sheep and lambs and Jesus as the protective shepherd and the world as wolves. It just blows my mind how I could have subscribed to that idea. Under cognitive theory, they attribute the development of DPD to a parent believing their child is constantly in danger, so therefore is threatened by their child developing autonomy. So letting their child learn from experience seems too dangerous to them. If we just insert the cult into the position of the parent in all of these theories of how DPD develops, it just makes so much sense. The cult was like an authoritative parent to us, where we were told exactly how to live, what to wear, how to speak, just everything. Us being autonomous was a threat to the cult. I mean, I literally had the preachers coming to my house and telling me I shouldn't be studying psychology and philosophy when I was in high school. Thinking for ourselves, dressing the way we wanted, engaging in activities that strengthened social ties with people outside the cult, having access to pop culture were all frowned on. This made us learn that we couldn't be trusted to take care of ourselves and make our own decisions. And from such an anxious parent, the theory posits that the child learns extreme fear of the world and that trusting in themselves and their own instincts is dangerous. And I would argue we learned the same thing. We had a fear of the world and becoming like the world, and we very much had to ignore our own instincts. We believed we needed God to save us from ourselves. And the last view they presented was evolutionary theory, which they said views DPD as relying on others to make life meaningful and being independent is threatening. I can definitely relate to that. Being independent is hugely threatening to me right now. I know in theory I'm definitely capable of it, but the feeling I have there is that it's very scary. Evolutionary theory emphasizes that the growth of individuals with DPD is stopped at the edge of childhood. This does make sense for those of us who were born into the cult. We weren't encouraged at all to branch out and think for ourselves and make life choices on our own. Even when it came to career, we were considering the cult and what sort of life we would have in it. We didn't get to explore the world in the brazen way most teenagers do. And so I personally feel like I did miss out on some of that development. While people my age say they feel so much older than teenagers, I find myself saying that I don't feel a whole lot older than that. They also talk about narrow attachment potentially being a source of DPD. When one person is the sole source of care and survival, then there's a lack of variety of experiences. In the context of the cult, we did rely on one source for care and survival, in our minds at least. And we did have an extreme lack of variety of experiences, considering that we surrounded ourselves by only those who were in the cult. I did attend school and have friends at school, but I was always encouraged to keep a healthy distance. There were things that I could only really share with those who knew God in the way I did, and those people were the ones I tried to surround myself with. When you think about the way that we went away and isolated ourselves from the world at convention time, and then we spoke about going back into the world but taking convention with us, it just shows how much we sought to surround ourselves with reinforcing points of view. We were afraid to confront, we were afraid to debate, and we were afraid to be around people that were different to us. We were afraid of the influence that anyone else who held a different view could have on us, which in a way speaks to how fragile that belief was. And I suppose because our belief was so fragile, maybe that's what caused us to defend it so vehemently. Vehemently? I'm no expert on psychology or pronunciation. So back to talking about restricted opportunities to explore during development. I'd say we fit into this. We believed that we had everything we needed in the way, so being independent was risky and not necessary. This meant that some of us potentially would have been less mature and less competent than those around us, which would have then strengthened our belief that we were inferior and less capable. When in fact, we weren't less capable, we were just less experienced and less exposed. In individuals with DPD, this can make them separate from their peers and go back to their parents. Well, in our case in the cult, it made us separate from the world and go running to God, which is what they wanted us to do. I'm starting to feel like William Irvine and co. just looked at dependent personality disorder and went, yes, this is perfect. How do we recreate that? In the podcast, they also talked about how people around individuals with DPD might get frustrated with them, which creates a pattern of them having experiences in the world that reinforce their feelings of inferiority, which then send them back home where they feel like they need to be taken care of by their family specifically. And I do know for myself that I've had some really emotional experiences where I've struggled to make a simple decision, and someone close to me has become frustrated, which has caused me to freeze up and then break down because I start beating myself up and feeling super inadequate and snowballing into catastrophic thinking. I know I personally definitely need some help when it comes to making choices sometimes. Sometimes I'm really great at it, but other times a simple thing like choosing what to eat can feel extremely overwhelming. As frustrating as I know this would be, the most helpful thing those around me can do in that situation is to be patient and kind. And I know that I myself need to address those thoughts when they come up and remind myself that I am capable of making a decision and it's okay to make the wrong one. But also understanding that these feelings make sense. The overwhelming sense of guilt whenever we did anything that might get us judged by anyone else made it really hard to live and make decisions and be confident in our decisions. If you get seen doing the wrong thing, you get talked about. You get judged. You get looked down on. We didn't have strong social support outside the cult because we were discouraged from participating in worldly activities, which meant we were completely dependent on the group. Also, critical thinking was strongly discouraged. Whenever I had questions, I was told to pray about it and deepen my faith. We weren't encouraged to think or act dependently at all, and we weren't encouraged to have conversations about anything that might differ from the views of the cult. Because when you think about it, we weren't just told how to behave, we were told how to think. And if we even thought the wrong thoughts, we were sinners. So it's no wonder that making even simple choices after leaving the cult can be quite daunting at times. Thinking for ourselves can be very scary. To even plan a life for ourselves outside the cult is huge. Simply thinking about how to set goals and make them happen could seem extremely overwhelming for anyone after leaving. I just think the takeaway from this is to be really kind to ourselves and to realize that what we're thinking and feeling, even if we feel overwhelmed, makes complete sense based on what we've been through. The first step for me is to be aware of it, because if I'm not aware of it and where it comes from, I can't even begin to tackle these feelings and internal views. And I haven't even delved into what I think of my looks. I might leave that for another episode, but basically, we weren't encouraged to dress in a way that made us look appealing to the world, or to people in the cult in general, probably, I don't know. We were definitely discouraged from doing things that made us appear sexually attractive to other people, which in turn for me made me scared of being sexually attractive. It made me uncomfortable being sexually attractive. It made me uncomfortable being attractive in general, I think. And so therefore, I really struggled to view myself as attractive and to feel attractive. And I definitely don't want to go the rest of my life feeling inferior, incompetent, and ugly. So I know that these are thoughts that I definitely need to tackle. And I'm really happy that I'm starting to think into where these feelings might have come from, because when I have a reason for why I feel the way I feel, then I can start to realize that the justification that I'm using to feel that way is wrong. So maybe, just maybe, I can start to break down those internal beliefs imposed on me by the cult and life experience. And maybe I can start to build myself up and feel good about myself and capable of making decisions and building a life in the world. But it's a process, and I can't expect it all to happen at once. So I probably should say not to take any of this as advice or even fact. Go and do your own research, because I was going to say I'm nothing, but I am a person who is going on a journey of self-reflection for myself. And I'm sharing what I'm finding out along the way. And I really hope that if there's anyone out there feeling the same as me, maybe you will do some of your own research and self-reflection. And I would love it if you would share that with me as well, because maybe it could help me. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. I really appreciate you. If you'd like to reach out, ask any questions, vent, say whatever you need to say, even if that's getting annoyed about something I've said, email me at exculted@gmail.com. That's exculted@gmail.com. And always remember, you can walk your own way, speak your own truth, and live your own life. Bye!